Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start at the top of the hour. And if you're trickling in over the next few minutes, great. But there's a lot to get through. So I'm just going to get right into it. You're joining us for leveling up your technical interviews. This is a wonderful panel. I'm really excited about this. This is something that I care very deeply about. And I think probably a lot of people have a lot of feelings about in general. Um, the webinar is going to run for about 45 minutes, after which both myself and all the panelists will land in the hiring channel in the lead dev community Slack. So if you're not already there, navigate there or towards the end of the session, and we'll take any questions that we haven't answered here over to that channel. So we'll maybe, I don't know, depending on how things go, have time to answer a couple questions live. So the Q&A feature on Zoom should be open to you. We'll probably get to them towards the end if we do get to them. And the lovely lead dev team will copy paste everything that we don't get to into the Slack channel at the end. So don't worry, if we don't get to it here, we will get to it in the channel. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Mode. I'm a senior staff engineer at Slack. I've been there for just over 7 years, which makes me a dinosaur. If you ever wondered what a dinosaur looks like, it's me. And today I'm going to be joined with this really wonderful panel. I'm so excited for you to meet all of them if you have not seen them in other lead dev content already. We are going to kick things off with Jachi.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Jachi. I am an engineering manager at GitHub on the database infrastructure team. I'm based out of Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm gonna apologize in advance that my dog is very excited about the leaves falling from the trees, so he's barking a lot today. I'm really excited to be here because I do think that technical interviews get a bad rep, but there's so little time to get a signal from both the candidate and also for the candidate to get a signal from the interviewing team that it's so important to use that time wisely and be able to have both the interviewee and interviewer get a sense of like what is the job like and can the candidate perform the job well. And too often I think technical interviews end up checking a box instead of like thinking about what is the actual role that they're interviewing for. So excited to have that discussion here.
Oh man, yeah, I feel that. All right, next up we've got Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael. I am representing the engineering team from CodeSignal. I have been part of a lot of interview processes, but I work also for a company that specializes in, technical interviews and assessment software. And so talked to companies from the very, very, very small to the very big, to the ones that might surprise you that have technical interview processes like universities or staffing agencies and other different types of things. So I think about interviews a lot, all day, every day, as a candidate, from a business perspective, as an interviewer, and so I'm just very excited to be able to think about it and talk about it more with all of our great other panelists.
That's great. All right, next up, Moishe.
Hi there, I'm Moishe. I'm a principal engineer at a company called Daily, and we do WebRTC infrastructure. And my background with interviewing is, I think, like, I just have a lot of feelings about it. I've had a lot of kind of like almost life-changing experiences, both as a candidate and as an interviewer. And I think it's an opportunity to do like really good work as an interviewer. And I think there's kind of a lot of depth to it that's really interesting, like from a technical and human perspective.
Yeah, could not agree more. All right, Mustafa.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Mustafa. I am heading the engineering team at Coursera. I'm another dinosaur. I've been there for more than 9 years. Um, yeah, a long time. I'm really excited to be part of this great panel because, yeah, just having seen a lot of different interview styles is like, it just varies so much by company, by the team you interview for. So there's a lot of nuance to getting it right, and so it's a great discussion to have.
Okay, so now that we are all familiar with everyone here, I'm going to set the stage a little bit to start off our conversation, and we'll sort of meander from there. So I think we can pretty safely say that the last year has been a roller coaster ride for hiring. We've seen swarms of layoffs starting probably around this time last year and sort of starting the 2023. And then it was punctuated by like sudden jolts of hiring frenzies fueled by the sudden need to build for generative AI, among other things. It's been a pretty wild ride. I don't know about all of you, but I was nodding along like a total bobblehead when I was reading the description for this panel originally, because I was like, yes, yes, technical interviews are treacherous. Yes, it's really difficult to effectively do this. It is really terrible. We should probably talk about this. And given it's still spooky season, I know Halloween was yesterday and today is November 1st, but it's still spooky season in my book. Let's start with some horror stories. So I don't want to drag anyone or any given company through the mud, but so we'll anonymize, obviously. But I would love to hear from each of you about your worst interview experiences. And most importantly, why? Why was it so terrible? And these can be from the interviewer's perspective. You had a terrible experience interviewing someone, or as an interviewee. I know that I personally have way more horror stories. Not that I have that many horror stories, but for me, like the visceral feeling of like, oh, the thing that I come up with is as an interviewee. But we'll see. There's a variety in the group. So I'm going to kick things off with Michael.
Yeah, for sure. I know all of us have all kinds of horror stories from our candidate perspective. I'm sure one really notable on-site interview that I had, I remember the thing that left me feeling really bad after one of my sessions was that the interviewer asked me one of those questions that just has a trick that you just have to get. You just have to get it or you don't. There's not really anything between to sort of work your way up. Start with the naive thing, optimize it, talk through it. They just wanted me to get it. There were no like intermediate steps, and I didn't get it. And I felt bad. I felt like I should have gotten it. Afterward, I was beating myself up like, oh, come on, I should have realized that. It's a lot of pressure. You can tell at the moment that they emotionally check out and they just give up on you. And if they do that, shortly into an hour-long session, it's just the most crushing feeling in the world. From that same onsite, actually, in another session, one more thing that happened was I had a whiteboarding session, and first of all, I don't like whiteboarding. I barely remember how to write with my hands anymore. I carry my mechanical keyboard around with me when I travel. And like not only was it a whiteboarding session, but the whiteboard had like come off of the conference room wall and it was just on the ground propped up. And I had to crouch down to like write on it with a marker. And it was just the most unpleasant code writing experience you could possibly imagine. And having both of those things happen in the same onsite, I left that day feeling like this was awful. This was horrible. I'm just going to pretend this never happened. It was just a really frustrating feeling.
Oh no, that's terrible. On so many levels. Yeah, I also really can't stand whiteboard interviews. I think also I get really intimidated because I'm not very tall. And and usually whiteboards are kind of an awkward height for me to begin with. And I does anyone have this problem where like they're writing a word and they like forget how to spell it like on a whiteboard but not on a piece of paper, and then you're like trying to stand back and like being like, wait, I wrote this wrong. Oh man, it's really terrible. Any others on the panel who like really dread whiteboard interviews? Oh, Moisha, what's your horror story? I guess it does not involve whiteboard interviews.
It doesn't directly involve whiteboard interviews. So a bunch of years ago, I interviewed to go back to a certain large tech company that I worked at for a really long time. And I'd worked on hiring at that company, so I knew how things worked. But I'd also at that point sort of been, doing interview training at other companies and so on. So also, as background, I'm profoundly undereducated. Like I don't really know much math. I know computer stuff, but not math stuff. So I go into this interview and the guy asked me to implement matrix multiplication. And I've never like done anything with matrices, or hadn't at the time. And I think there's a world where I could have like muscled my way through it and like learned how matrix multiplication works intuitively enough to get to the question I knew he was going to get to, which was distributed matrix multiplication. Like I'd seen that in interviews before, so I knew where he wanted to go. But like after banging my head against this and like making dumb mistakes over and over again on the whiteboard trying to do matrix multiplication so I could code it, I actually called a timeout and I was like, look, I know where you're going. I don't think I'm going to get you there. And I don't know what we're learning from this interview at this point. Like, could we maybe take a different tack? And he just flat out refused. He was like, this is where the interview's going. Like, if you don't make progress, sorry. So it felt bad on like multiple different levels.
Wow. Oh man, there's so much to like deconstruct there too. Oh, all right. Jachi, let's go.
Yeah, I think mine similar to a little bit of both. That one also involved math questions and also was on site. And it was a 2-in-1 interview. So there's two interviewers. So I felt very intimidated in that sense. And they would take turns asking questions. And it was very clear that, I know the answer, and they were just like shocked that you can't get it. And for me, I think it would also started with something to do with matrices. And I gotten that, but it was clear that they were in this hour time span, they were trying to ask like several mathematical word problem situations. So they really wanted to rapid fire through them. And it wasn't like take time to like think about what the gotcha is and figure it out. It was like answer this question so that we can move on to the next question. And it felt very much like one of those like math word problem statements you get in school where it's like train A is going in one direction, train B is going another direction. Like, when are they going to be certain miles apart? And it's just like, I need like, one, I need to like write everything down, read it, and think for a long time. And two, like, I cannot answer questions on the spot. Like, um, so definitely like very nerve-wracking to go into these like interviews and feel bombarded with like mathematical questions that are like, I guess in theory I could answer these, but I can't imagine having to do these type of like problem solving on the job.
Right. That's the other thing, right? And you mentioned that at the top when you were talking about like why you were excited to be here is like it's really hard to figure out how to evaluate someone in just like such a short little snippet amount of time. And everyone, yeah, has a different perception of like what that means. All right, Mustafa, let's go.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a horror story, but it is a bit of a funny story where I went for this interview and they started with pitching the team, right? And 2 minutes into the conversation, I realized they're pitching the wrong team to me because that's not the team I'm interviewing for. And so, and then, it went on for about 5, 10 minutes. So the other thing about this is like I was trying to speak to, let them know that this is not like the team that I was interviewing for, but they didn't take any signals from the interviewer either, and so they went on for 10 minutes. Uh, After that, obviously, we clarified it and laughed it off, but it was just funny to see there was some mix-up in preparation for the interview, I'm assuming. But as an interview, I took that off as like there's two things, right, that I saw as one is okay, I'm just another person in this interview cycle, and I got that feeling a little bit. And the other thing is it showed a bit of lack of preparation, right, in the interview.
Yeah, it's really tough when you're reminded that you're just like a number in this big cog of a machine, even if it's not a really big company. Sometimes it can feel that way at really small companies, and maybe it's because they're just like not incredibly organized in their recruiting process, and it's really rough to feel on the other end of that. I love hearing these stories, and if anyone on the call is compelled to share their own interviewing horror stories, I might drop some of my own in the hiring channel after this, but I would love to read them all later. So completely switching gears, I want to talk about best interview experiences, and then we can sort of dive into different themes and talk about why they're so different, like these worst experiences from these best experiences. So I think I'm going to work my way around in the same order as we went around for worst. So Michael, you go first.
Yeah, for sure. I've had a couple of interviews that both did something I really liked, and these are both at the on-site stage, but they sort of left me alone for a while. I don't know about you all. Maybe you code okay under pressure. Whenever somebody's looking at me, I do worse. It's like some kind of law of physics. I can't type, I can't spell. They just left me alone for a while. They set me up with a computer. They said, "This is what we'd like you to do," and it's kind of like that take-home style, but it's time gated. It's not like do this for 8 hours or however many hours it takes you, unknown amount of time, but just this is during your on-site time, and we're going to come back and check in, and we're going to talk about it together, like maybe you would do in a more realistic setting. And when you come back and you've been working, on some kind of project thing that is kind of realistic, that is hopefully similar to the actual work that they do, you are able to just kind of focus and not talk your way through it. It's actually kind of relaxing. You can get into a zone. It can be kind of fun, and it just feels very realistic. And so I've really enjoyed the couple of interviews that I've had that have been in that form.
Yeah, we started doing a little bit of that at Slack more recently. And I say more recently, probably like 4 years ago. I have a very, what's the word? Not biased, but slanted view of recently. But yeah, I felt like, I mean, I was never on the other side of that, but I'd heard really good feedback about how that made things a lot nicer. All right, Misha.
Yeah. So my second ever on-site interview was at Microsoft in 1994, and I was terrified. And like, there was no prep. Like, nobody told you what was happening other than you're going to be on site for 8 hours and you're going to get grilled. So I was extremely nervous at the time, even more than now. I was very, very bad at small talk. Like, I didn't want to have a conversation with somebody. And I think this magical thing happened when I went into my first interview is the interviewer was able to suss that out. Like, I think it was probably very obvious that I was nervous. Um, but he very quickly like put us into like, let's write some code on the whiteboard. Like, this was 1994, but like, let's write some code mode. And like, once I was there, like, the nervousness went away because I had a thing that I knew how to do that I could sort of show like competency at. And like, he really fed off that, and he was so good at like being encouraging but also challenging at the same time, that like it just took all the stress away and turned it into like, oh yeah, this is a lot like what I'd been doing every day for years. Um, and that sort of empathy like really struck with me. It wasn't a confrontational thing, it was a cooperative thing.
Yeah, finding the strength in the person you're interviewing and sort of trying to feed off of that is such a wonderful way to have a really good interview. But yeah, oh man, we can talk about empathy all day, every day. We can get into that a little bit more too once everyone's through their best stories. Jachi, I think you're next.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to talk about, I guess, experience entering for a EM role, which definitely wasn't a technical interview. I think different places have different technical assessments for EMs. And I really liked this interview because I really clicked with the interviewer. The interview itself went a lot longer than the original scheduled time because we were having really good discussions. Um, One of the other things that this company was doing at the time was they always sent me the interview questions in advance, like 24 hours in advance, which was also very nice. And of course, like we didn't follow exactly that script. It was just like, hey, here's some type of questions. And it was a mix of like behavioral about your management philosophy and also like what your technical philosophy experience and approach is. Um, and I thought that made it more, all that made it more of a conversation rather than just like a one-sided Q&A. And I got to learn a little bit more about, their technical perspective and how it might differ or align with how I think about things.
Yeah, I think there's a theme too, yeah, about like conversation, right? It's a back and forth. You're not just this like one wall, oh, like like in your terrible experience, which of like, nope, this is the problem. Like, just deal with it. Like, that's what we're doing. All right, Mustafa, what's yours?
Yeah, so I definitely agree. The conversation part came out in mine as well. So this was actually a surprise because it was one of the big tech companies, and I was not expecting this, but it was a very personalized experience on the interview, and I walked away with feeling that okay, I got a good sense of what it would be to work with the team. So I met with everyone on the team. I solved problems which were it was a whiteboard conversation, but it was the conversation where we're brainstorming a solution versus like write this piece of code, right? And so it was a lot of like the thought process and the brainstorming, and gave me a sense of like what it would be like working in this culture and this team. And so that was amazing because yeah, I think they walked away with a lot of value as well because they got signals on how I would work with the team as well. So I really like that.
Yeah, I feel like I agree with all of these in terms of like good experiences I've had. I think it very much. But I once walked out of an interview because it went so poorly on their end, not necessarily my end. Literally, the guy interviewing me was just scrolling Twitter while I was like writing code on a screen next to him. Yeah, it was terrible. Um, and the good interviews that I've had, I've walked out with like more energy than I had going in somehow. Like I felt so okay, cool. I felt so like buzzed about the people that I met. And even I remember walking out and feeling like if and actually this was my Slack interview like over 7 years ago, but I remember feeling like I don't care if I didn't even get anything right. Like I thought I'd gotten most things okay, but it's hard to know, right? Sometimes like how many more questions they have lined up and how far you can go. Um, but I was like, I actually don't even care if like I didn't like nail it. Like I'm so glad I got to meet these people. And it was just like such a like fun time. I think the word fun was, and I was like, wow, did I just say an interview was fun? Like, that's weird. That doesn't make any sense. That's not what I was setting myself up for. But it does seem like, so I was just taking notes this whole time about like themes of what made interviews generally terrible, what made interviews generally really great. And it seems like in the panel discussion, the prompt, we were talking about like what gives technical interviews a bad rep. And I feel like from the worst horror stories, there were very much themes of like it's like these tricks, or they're very like standard cracking the code in the interview. Like I never actually bought the book out of protest, really, mostly. But those like reverse linked list, and it's like I'm never gonna do that. And actually, if I ever work with anyone who writes their own library to do that and doesn't use the like open source already existing equivalent, like I'm gonna have some big questions. and and that does seem like to be a theme, right? Of like folks are not into these like you have to know the trick, you have to know that this is like a weird Java 8 quirk, all these things. It's all about like probably more like open-ended problem solving in general is like probably the best way to go. I don't know, Michael, I know that like you literally work in this space. What are your thoughts about like generally the ways to pick, because if you're interviewing for a very technical role, you do want to ask a relatively technical question, right? What are ways that we can pick good technical questions that sort of are reasonably time bound, but don't fall into the trap of, well, you just have to know that like this is how pointers work.
Honestly, I think a lot of the problem comes from not knowing, not being focused enough. Like, what are the skills that are actually going to make somebody successful in a role? And what is true for a role that's at a really big tech company that has a lot of onboarding capacity that can afford to put you through 6 months of training is going to be very different from that like 4-person startup that needs somebody that knows very specific things. And I think what happens is that you're like, hey, we're a company, we need an interview process. We don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about what that is. So we're going to reflect on what we did before at bigger companies. And we're going to port that over and we're going to start interviewing this way. Companies copy each other, they copy other processes that they know about, but they don't necessarily take the time to think, what should we prioritize to see, what is going to make somebody successful in this role? And I think the first step is always just to sit with that question. And the answer is going to be different for different roles, for different companies. You may need somebody who knows all of those quirks, but hopefully you have a good understanding of that as you're going in, and it's not something that's unintentional. Or you may have the capacity to ask these kind of open-ended problem-solving questions and train somebody, and you don't want to rule out candidates who don't know your stack yet. But you have to answer that for yourself before you can start asking any questions to candidates.
And just to follow up on that, like, how much should you be communicating this prior to the moment of onsite? I know that Chachi, you mentioned that one of the best interviews you had, they gave you the prompts or the general questions to think about ahead of time. I mean, not 3 weeks ahead of time, but 24 hours ahead of time. I don't know if Chachi or Michael, you want to go first, but I'd love your opinions on that.
The more, the better. I'll keep it short. The more that you can share ahead of time, the better. You don't want to surprise your candidates about what they're going to be measured on. Once I showed up for an interview and they started asking me, I don't know, Python threading questions. I never professionally worked with Python. I wasn't prepared for that. I was, what are you asking me? I'm not ready for this. It's not the right interview. And it's a waste of everybody's time if you're being measured on things that you shouldn't have been measured on. You can save everybody the time if you give that information up front.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I think at the very least, communicate the types of interviews that will be happening. I definitely understand, not everyone can share the full interview questions in advance. But at least setting the expectation, hey, you will have a behavioral interview, you will have a whiteboard exercise, you will have a technical deep dive. I think that's really good. There's certain companies that actually do publish their interview guides, there's blog posts they've written about, and that's also really valuable, I think, for candidates, because I do think that it's expected that candidates will also do research about the company itself. But when there's just no information, it's very hard to prepare.
Are there any off the top of your head, or that you can pop into the hiring channel later, of blog posts of companies that have published their interview process that you find particularly enlightening or helpful? I know that people are pretty much always wanting to consume more things in this space because they're very invested in obviously making their interview processes better. So I mean, that was my reaction immediately. It was oh, where are these blog posts? Let me go find them. I'm sure other people would appreciate that. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate on Michael. You're saying as much advance notice as possible is great. At least in my experience working on various parts of the interview process. So for additional context, at Slack, we have a take-home technical screen that is a code review exercise. And we've had that for, I think, about 5 years now. And there's one of the discussion pieces, and everyone is in two camps about this, and I'm very curious to see what people have to say about this, is we want to tell people please don't spend more than 2 hours doing this, because we want to be respectful of everyone's time, but we do give it to them with a week to return it to us. And depending on the type of exercise that you send home to a candidate, and I know that's very different than, I know we've been talking mostly about on-site experiences, but it is, I think, really important to touch on this pre-screening process if you have one, this take-home style portion of the interview. How do you weigh that? Because it's very obvious when we grade some of these submissions that people have spent 3 days looking at this. And I get it, you want to put your best foot forward and you want to submit something really great. but there's a reason why we have a code review exercise now rather than a take-home full coding assessment, because it's so much easier to sink infinite time into the coding assessment, but like mini project, than it is into a code review. So we sort of tried to artificially restrict the amount of time that people could spend on it. And as someone with a small child, I totally understand that we want everyone to be on the same level playing field in terms of time to create these deliverables, if we might use the business term. So where do you all stand? What do you think? Moshe, I feel like you were nodding along. I feel like you have opinions.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I did the take home for Slack, and
Yeah.
I spent 3 days on that, and I actually put a Konami code Easter egg into it, and like all sorts of wild stuff, and like I got the job, like that's cool. But a thing I always wanted to do with Slack was to try to, because at the time it was a GitHub repo that you submitted, and I always wanted to do a regression test on time from first commit to last versus chance of on-site, because I suspect that would be a very high R squared, right? Um, at the same time, like it was fun as a candidate to show off a little bit, right? Like, and there's that creativity aspect to it that's nice. And so I think like where I've landed at other companies is to make very, very, very explicit time constraints, like, and be super aware with the assignment. Like, we want you to spend 2 hours on this, and like this is a thing which is simple enough that 2 hours is enough to make good progress on it. And like just be transparent. Like this is about fairness, right? Like not everybody can spend a whole weekend on it, and we want people to be on a level playing field. And I think that sort of goes to the empathy piece, and also like trusting that your candidates have empathy also. So like it's a tricky thing, but more transparency is good.
Yeah, Mustafa, go.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'll plus one the time limit. I think we've also done this take home exercise. And one of the other things that I think works well is you can have some optionality in the interview process as well, because different people have different ways of being successful at an interview, and some people don't like synchronous coding, and they would rather do a take home. So we've had this like, okay, you can do it either this way or that way with the time limit. And the other thing that's useful is to still make it a collaborative experience. So, you have some time to do this. Don't spend more than 2 hours, but let's after that discuss how you approach the problem and solve the problem, right? And that combination tends to work really well as well.
I really like that, the like full follow through, because that is how we actually work, right? And I feel like that is one of the biggest reasons why technical interviews get this bad rap, is like, well, I'm not actually going to be reversing a linked list. It has to be pertinent to like how I actually work. So yeah, I really like that, like the closing the loop of like, it's not just a thing you do in the void and like, I don't know, it just lands somewhere and no one really cares about it ever again. Which I find that is much more common than there's this very big sense. I don't know, I'm like kind of perplexed by this now, of like there's this like everything is so throwaway, like one thing to the other, and that's not at all how work is. Everything is sort of one big glob of everything is interconnected, and I feel like that's also what makes a very successful engineer, at least in my experience, is someone who's able to see the threads connecting various pieces. Yeah, that sounds like a really great way to think about it too. I really like that. All right, another thread that I wanted to pull on was this sense of this realistic setting. So Michael, you talked about this, of like, I got to be in a bubble and like look at the code and like type away at it, probably significantly better than you're hunching over the fallen off whiteboard situation. I think ergonomics actually is like the point that I want to have some sort of discussion around, because that can really make or break your experience as an interviewee, right? Like I'm physically uncomfortable in the space for whatever reason, which is going to exacerbate all of my nerves, et cetera. but also thinking about like, how do we make that really inclusive? How do we think about like diversity in the scope of building ergonomic interview experiences? I know that a lot of people are working remotely now, and so like remote interviews sort of enable you to be in your own space, which is probably a huge benefit for a lot of folks like me who just like freeze up real hard the second anything is like any sort of assessment. So I would love to, if anyone, this is fair game, anyone can dive in on this one, thinking about ergonomics.
I think like a thing that I talk about is just like when you introduce yourself, like give the candidates some space to make themselves comfortable at the start of the interview, right? Like ask if they need to use the bathroom, ask if they want a snack or a drink. Like just, I mean, this is more on-site than like remote interviewing, but I think there's even space for it in remote, especially if you're doing a
Yeah.
string of remote interviews. It's almost worse because you're not moving yourself physically between spaces. You don't get that break. So just like, again, going back to the empathy thing, just like making space for the candidate to take care of themselves.
Yeah, that's really big.
I think as much as possible, trying to give them an environment in which they're comfortable. I think remote interviews help with this a lot because everybody does stuff on their computer. So you're on your computer, you already have your tool of the trade. Great. Much better than writing code on a piece of paper or a whiteboard. And I do think that helps a lot. Even in on-site settings, though, let them use a computer. Let them use their computer. Let them use a computer that you provide. Let them type. The more familiar the environment is, the better, the more realistic and relevant it is at letting them show their best skill, not something more artificial. If they really need autocomplete, like let them use autocomplete. Don't be too strict about stuff like that. Let them use the tools that they would use on the job because that's what they're going to do on the job, right? So if that helps them be successful, just let them show their skills that way.
Mustafa, I saw that you unmuted at the same time.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the empathy piece is the most important, right? Just realizing that interviews are a very stressful thing for most people. And how can you alleviate that? Like one of the ways of doing that is just setting context in the beginning of the meeting as well, right? Okay, I don't really care about like getting to the conclusion in this case. I just care about how you're thinking through this and how you're collaborating with. Just saying that as well helps, calm the nerves down and makes it more of a conversation versus like, yeah, there is the question, and I'm just going to now uh, scroll Twitter to use your bad example there, but um, yeah, which makes it a much better experience for the interviewee.
So there's one more question I want to ask before I jump into the submitted Q&A. And that's the hotness question. The latest hotness is ChatGPT, generative AI, whatever, GPT 3.5. I did not pay for access to GPT-4. I'm too cheap for that. I use it a ton actually in my job every day for any number of things. And how is that going to impact interviews, specifically in technical interviews, right? And I think one stance that I've been very grateful for, that I think more and more companies are taking with regards to these technical assessments, is like, if you want to Google something, Google something. If you want to like look at Stack Overflow, look at Stack Overflow, because that's how we do our jobs. Right? Like, I will not remember how to do like substring of something on a language that like I write once a week off the top of my head. Like, I do rely on autocomplete in that sense. How do we think this whole like generative AI thing is going to shape interviews moving forward? What can we do to get ahead of it to make sure that we're still assessing people in the best way, but also like, I don't know, making sure there's empathy piece? Because like, if there's one thing that like generative AI does not have is empathy for anyone involved. And I think that's been such a big theme in this conversation. I just want to make sure that like people walk out of here being like, okay, I have some general sense of like what I'm going to do about this problem. Who wants to go first?
I can go for this one. So I spend a lot of time on this because it's interesting, because working at Coursera, we have to also think of it as how it impacts education, right? Because
Yeah.
you're assessing students and how does that change. And a good analogy here is those one of those open book exams, right? That you used to do, and I feel like that's how we should be treating this. Is it's yet another tool in your toolkit to use GitHub Copilot, or even if you want to put things in ChatGPT. What I'm more interested in is how you're using those tools to solve the problem versus um, versus trying to like avoid using some of these tools. So I think it's like, yeah, it's yet another tool. I feel like the way the problem should be assessed is by how you solve the problem using these tools versus getting to a specific answer.
Yeah, I would preface by saying I haven't done any interviews, like conducted interviews as an interviewee since generative AI really blew up on the scene. But at work, like we are highly encouraged to use generative AI to like improve our processes, improve our workflow, use Copilot to alleviate like developer toil. Of course, like use it in a safe, secure way, but we're certainly encouraged to incorporate like AI into our day-to-day work, and that's a process that's been going. So if you interview and join a company and that's the culture, then I do feel like same, like we should be upfront about that. And same with like what you talked about Googling. It's like I think, yeah, you shouldn't be expected to memorize like the syntax book of like Python 3 or whatever. Like you should be able to Google for things that normally on the job you would just look up.
I want to add to that a little bit too. I agree with all of the points made so far. I also think that the content has to be tailored to make it appropriate to be open book. And using the math exam analogy, you might, if you're in third grade and you're doing your multiplication tables, it's not appropriate to use a calculator for that because the skill that you're trying to measure is something where the calculator would trivialize it. But when you're doing, calculus or something later on, it's okay. It's totally fine because that's not the skill that you're trying to measure. And so for a given interview, if you really care about somebody's ability to do algorithmic thinking that you think an AI tool would trivialize, then don't allow it. But if you're going to have an open book format, you want to make sure that your content is something that's more complex, it's something more realistic, something that if you were doing it on the job, AI would help you, but not trivialize it. And so it's important to be thoughtful about the kind of material that you pair with those different types of formats.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Maisha, I know you sent me a link to this like really creepy thing in when we were talking about the panel where like AI was doing the interviewing of people, and I may or may not have had nightmares about that since. Can you provide a little bit of context on that link and like why I'm scared?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the company that was doing that, but it is like a tool that uses generative AI. Like you feed it the candidates, I expect, like resume and other stuff, and it creates an interview and interacts with the candidate. And I think like there is this I mean, this has been true forever, like a desire to commoditize interviews or turn them into a repeatable machine. And I think this is just like the latest manifestation of that. Like it's different because generative AI is different, but I think like uh the thing, like going back to what we talked about when we talked about great interviews, right? Like that feeling and the empathy piece, right? And the human connection piece. Like candidates care about where they go to work, and you convey a lot of information about your company in your interview process. So I like there probably is room where these tools will be useful. But I maybe, but I think that like sort of from an ethical and moral and like even just who you want to hire perspective, keeping humans at the forefront of it feels really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're at the 45-minute mark. I'm so sorry, Vivek, for your question. I think it's going to have to land in the hiring channel. But we're we're going to land in there and we're going to answer questions for the next little bit. I know some of us are going to have the Slack channel open for on and off for the rest of the day too. So if you want to reach out in there, we'll be there. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I think that was a really great spot to land. I know I could have kept talking about this for a very, very long time, and I hope that the conversation continues. And yeah, don't be strangers. Thanks so much for joining us. See you all on channel.